So as Hondo mentioned, and we've heard throughout the day, we're at a point in time now where warfare is changing. Advances in big data, artificial intelligence, microelectronics are changing the world right now and changing how we fight, which we're seeing displayed very vividly and tragically in the war in Ukraine, where the battlefields become much more transparent and adaptation has changed much more, and militaries are faced with challenges that they haven't seen in previous years. That war and the reemergence of great power competition that it points to has increased the technology sector's focus on defense in ways we haven't seen as much in recent years, and the desire to work with the department, and the Department of Defense's desire to work with the technology sector as well. So today we have a fantastic group of panelists that will discuss how industry, the Department of Defense, and the broader US government can work together more effectively to improve our national defense. So to introduce them real quick, we have Zachary Mears from Anduril, we have Mandy from BigBear.ai, Don from Kodiak Robotics, and then Commodore Michael Brasseur, who is at Saab and the former Commodore of Task Force 59. So from there, we'll kick it off into questions. So, Commodore Brasseur, can you describe how you engage with industry in your role as Commodore of Task Force 59 and how your organizational structure enabled that engagement?
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, it's great to be back here in DC at Nexus 23. I was here last year, having just run a major exercise called IMX, and it's been quite an amazing year since then. Task Force 59, and I'm going to be speaking primarily as the former, what we call former Commodore of Task Force 59, and not so much as the Chief Strategy Officer at Saab. But the way we engaged with industry was we worked very closely with DIU. We were focused on solving operational problems in the operational environment alongside warfighters. And, you know, we were focused in the waters surrounding the Arabian Peninsula, which, as you know, is a problem-rich environment over there. Just this past week, Iran, I think, took 2 merchant vessels. There's everything from kinetic one-way attacks, one-way UAV attacks, piracy, you know, so all that's sort of challenge space. And that's sort of set against a situation where a lot of the assets were flowing other places. We were looking to commercial dual-use technologies to help solve our problems today. And we thought the best point of entry for that is DIU. We worked very closely with Michael Brown, and we did a call to industry called Digital Horizon. So basically looking for best-in-breed robotics and artificial intelligence, focused primarily on maritime domain awareness, and that's basically getting a lot of sensors out on the water, above, on, and below the water, fusing the data, exploiting the data with machine learning and AI so we could be more precise in how we deployed our manned assets. We organized around a model called the capability sprint model. Sky Moore, who will be here tomorrow, helped design that. She's now the CTO at CENTCOM. She was our chief strategy officer for a period. And the capability sprint model started with the notion of a tech scan, as I mentioned, just as we did with DIU, a burn-in, just like Peter Singer's book, burning in the operational environment alongside the warfighter, taking the robotics and artificial intelligence to their limits, all the while sort of building trust with the warfighter and then sprinting out onto real operational missions. And I think you kind of saw that cycle come to fruition just a couple weeks ago when when Task Force 59, I was no longer there, did a mission through the Straits of Hormuz, an operational mission that really kind of was the culmination of all the work that we had done before. And then we kind of continue that cycle. And so we organized, not in a Napoleonic structure, as you might expect in the military, we more of a structure like you might see at Anduril or Big Bear, you know, with a CTO and a COO, and so we were organized around the model. So that's how that was our approach, and that's how we organized, and I hope to talk about some of the things we accomplished a bit later in the conversation.
Absolutely, and we'll get into some of Task Force 59's accomplishments and then also explore more about the sprint model that you've discussed as well. Before that, Don, your company was selected to participate in the Army's Robotic Combat Vehicle program. Can you explain how some of your commercial work in trucking and autonomy on road dovetails with the RCV program?
Absolutely. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Don Burnette, and I've spent about 15 years working in the self-driving space now, going all the way back when it was just a bunch of lab projects in academia, seeing it go through the R&D process, and now we're definitely at the cusp of true commercialization of the self-driving technology. And at Kodiak, we've always been focused on the long-haul semi-truck industry when it comes to autonomy, but we've always kept an eye on the opportunities to apply our technology as it relates to defense. And I think that autonomy is going to have a significantly positive impact on the efficiency, the cost, and ultimately the safety of our warfighters that are in conflict situations. Now, coming back to the company, we actually started in 2021 with an SBIR to work with the U.S. Air Force, the great folks, the leaders at the Dover Air Force Base, automating the flight line of the future. And we demonstrated autonomous capability moving moving goods and people in and around the flight line. That was a really successful project. And in this past October, we signed on with the RCV program through a DIU grant that was awarded over a two-year span, and that is to bring our commercial autonomy and what technology we've been developing for the commercial market over to the defense applications. So to show and prove that the commercial technology can be applied in the military scenarios that they're interested in. And I think there's a huge opportunity to do more on the commercial side, to bring that technology over to the defense space. 70% of all of the funding that goes into autonomy comes from the private sector. And I think there's a huge opportunity for the DoD to be able to leverage that investment and leverage a lot of the rapid iteration and success that's happened in that space. And ultimately, I think by partnering with companies that are working in the commercial sector, the DoD can roll out autonomy faster and ultimately cheaper.
Thank you, Don. Mandy, your company was one of Task Force 59's partners. Can you describe that relationship from the industry perspective? We've heard from Michael already about the government perspective.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me in the Big Bear team. So I'm actually relatively new in the role. I came in as CEO in October to BigBear.ai. I'm a longtime tech industry veteran. I spent most of my career in a variety of highly regulated spaces and was early days in working with the agencies to determine how to actually regulate and clear diagnostic applications of AI in the medical world. And so I've brought a lot of that forward, and I think it's becoming even more relevant on a day-to-day basis associated with what we're trying to figure out now. But our participation in Task Force 59 was a really important milestone for Big Bear, because while often confused with a startup, we're not. Right? We've been at this for more than 2 decades. We have deep and trusting relationships with over 15 agencies across the DoD and IC, and we take what we do very seriously. We became a public company in 2021, which is where I think the startup confusion comes from. But as I said, right, we know what we're doing, and we've been at it for a while. Where we live, right, in our role in Task Force 59, there's a big part of our business that's focused on autonomous systems. And a lot of that for us as a software provider is that we focus on things like computer vision and descriptive analytics and prescriptive and predictive analytics. And in the case of what we did both at Task Force 59 and then this year, right, at IMX 23, which is where we brought everything together, is that we look at ourselves in playing the role of, in many ways, the substrate. Right? So how do you provide the connective tissue between what's happening out on the water, right, what's happening in the command center, and how all of that data and those payloads move around and then begin to interact, right, with the models that can actually provide valuable insights for the operators to make really critical decisions. And how do you do that in an environment that's not always consistent, right, from a connectivity standpoint and from a, just frankly, a payload quality standpoint. So that's a lot of where we've really found our footing and has led us to a continued just phenomenal relationship that we have, and we're very excited about the future. But the one kind of other note that I think is important to make about Big Bear is that we don't only do work in autonomy, right? So we're a very large provider in the complex manufacturing, supply chain, and logistics. We do a lot of work there, as well as in cybersecurity.
Thank you. Zach, you've served in roles close to the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and now at Anduril. Can you describe how you see the relationship between industry and DoD changing over the last few years?
Absolutely, and again, just to echo the sentiments of the rest of the panel, really want to thank the Applied Intuition team and the entire support team that is putting this two-day conference together. I think the substance has been covered to date, will be covered over the remainder of today and tomorrow. Just reading the topic areas harkens back to some of the very things that got Bob Work excited about a Defense Science Board study on autonomy in 2015. And just to lighten the room up a smidge, I'll go back to a joke that Bob would tell often, so apologies in advance if you heard this at any number of his speeches. But I think it speaks to, as we think about the problems we're trying to solve, the role of creativity in combination with technology that's ultimately going to bring those composed solutions together in a way that addresses some of the problems that Michael and his team faced out in the Persian Gulf. But Bob used to tell a story about a Marine Patrol in Helmand Province. 4 guys out. They spot what they believe to be a set of individuals implanting improvised explosive devices on the roadside. Their rules of engagement don't permit them to engage kinetically, so they're standing watch. Ultimately, they start to make a maneuver over the hill to try to gain better position, to observe what they're doing. The individuals implanting what they believe to be the devices disperse, but they leave behind a donkey strapped to a cart. So the guys go down, they approach the donkey, they do indeed find the remnants of devices that were being implanted on the roadside. They look at each other and like, well, what do we do? Sergeant walks up, unlatches the donkey from the cart and says, we follow the donkey. Donkey, lo and behold, trots off just over a kilometer, leads them back to a village, saddles up next to a house. They take custody of now 4 individuals who were indeed implanting explosive devices. They get back to base, do their ARR. Captain's asking the sergeant, what made you think to unhook the donkey? He's like, sir, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska. I'm a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I've been following jackasses my whole life. But Bob would tell the story, not to drop the pejorative, but to focus on the fact that we've got incredibly creative humans within our U.S. and allied armed forces. And our job as now leaders in the technology areas that are driving innovative delivery of solutions to complicated integrated problems is to not lose sight of the fact that that technology, absent organizing ourselves differently and approaching how we solve those problems creatively, that technology is not the multiplier. It's multiplied when you understand how to integrate it against the operational challenges that are being presented to U.S. and allied forces. And that same ethos then informs, well, how do you organize a company most effectively to be able to have composable parts, whether it's their own parts, Anduril software, Anduril hardware, or as was the case in Task Force 59, many of our software solutions integrated with third-party assets. Absent our ability to build composable systems, not sell a product, but actually build composable solutions against these problems, that's what it takes to echo words that Hondo just offered, how we operate at speed of relevance. There are other things that we obviously, I think we'll get into over the course of the day, of like how you scale that. But I think that mindset, that approach, that openness is ultimately what's required to take the best of what modern software enables, integrated with modern hardware, to tackle these complex challenges.
As an Army veteran, I can vouch for the realism of the officer-NCO relationship in that joke. But so there's been a couple themes that have come out in your opening remarks where, Michael, you talked about the importance of partnering industry and warfighters in an operational environment. And Don and Mandy, you both talked about the kind of fungibility of some data and lessons learned for structural issues or specific challenges. And then Zach, you talked about being able to tap into creativity, organizing yourself to tap into creativity. So one of the great and kind of sometimes untapped benefits of working with technologists is problem curation. The idea that you can understand operational problems much more effectively by bringing together not just warfighting experts, not just expert strategists, but also technologists who understand what the range of the solution space is more effectively, and sometimes what the problem space is more effectively. So as a technologist, in looking at places like Ukraine, Syria, and other recent battlefields, what are some of the operational challenges or operational imperatives that you've seen emerge over the last couple of years that are different, perhaps, than some of them that you've seen come from DoD? So we started from the right and worked our way left. We'll go the other direction now. So we'll start with Zach.
Well, and frankly, I didn't answer your first question. So, yeah, I will say, just because I think it's relevant to how we think about what we're learning and observing in Ukraine today, how that might be applicable to other high-end operational challenges that we could face in a potential peer competition in the Indo-Pacific, which by their very nature, both for us as well as many of our allies and partners, are what many would characterize as a very challenging away game. How are you sustaining your ability to understand an operational environment in which an adversary is seeking to deny you that understanding, deny your ability to communicate with both your as well as allied and partner forces that might be able to generate effect in that environment, and your ability, once you're expending actual hardware capability, how you replenish that in a way and in a rate that is actually responsive to the sustained threat that these operational challenges inevitably will unfold in. The battle might be quick to start, but it is going and has proven to be enduring in how it has unfolded. And I think what that means for all the goodness that has transpired since I left the department in 2016, the sheer volume of companies, and would love to pick whatever number lives in Mike Brown's brain in terms of the number of companies that the DIU has vetted over the last 7 years. Can extract it from their annual report, I'm sure. But the attack surface that the department now has in terms of the national security innovation base to which it has access just is vastly larger than when we opened the doors at Moffett Base back in 2015 of what was then DIUX. It was an experiment of, particularly based off of Ash's experience going back to Stanford, understanding that the best of commercial technology, particularly just modern software, we don't need to talk about general AI, we don't need to talk about complex behavioral autonomy, just the basics, is available to us today. And it has been invested in for decades, 15 years as one example in this panel, both in the intellectual knowledge and then ultimately the intellectual property to develop that commercial capability. It's been available to us. How do we gain access to that and start to turn it against the problems that are relevant to the department? How do we understand the barriers and the opportunities to taking that commercial product to a missionized solution? What exists within the ecosystem, within the defense industrial base today that enables that? Where are the constraints that still exist? And so I think the composable tools are now just so much more plentiful today than they were 5 to 7 years ago. I think we still have the challenge of scaling that adoption, and it's efforts like Michael's at Task Force 59 that enable us to do that. But it's experimenting still at one element of scale. And I think one of the bigger tasks for folks in this room to tackle, many of which are not necessarily resonant on the software side, but when you get into actual software-defined, adaptive manufactured products that you can produce at volume that can get payloads of operational relevance in an environment that matters, sustain those operations under adversary threats, the production timelines required to deliver that capability at a relevant time and place is not represented by the infrastructure and capacity that we currently have resident in the DIB. We have to make investments in that area. So I think that the types of problems that Ukraine is exposing is not necessarily one about the operational effectiveness of the capability, albeit there are some of those, but in particular how we're going to be able to continue to sustain the production and delivery of those relevant systems. I think that's one of the next big challenges, particularly as we think about sustaining that over transoceanic distances.
Thank you, Zach. Mandy?
Yeah, I was looking at the clock because I think my marketing team will be really proud of me. I went 17 minutes before I completely went off the script and decided to just share my opinion. So I think your question's really important because it's a topic that we don't talk enough about, which is that I think the war in Ukraine is bringing out in a major way. When you have a compressed timeline and you're dealing with a circumstance that is inherently imperfect and you're still asking people to make decisions, you have to begin to be very careful about deciding what people's superpowers are and how to use them. I think the kind of biggest thing that I would say, right, as a technologist, as someone who does this for a living and who has spent many years focused on the craft of building and delivering technology to an end user in a variety of different really complex industries, I don't need help with the how, right? My job, right, my organization's job is the how. Like that is what we do for a living, right? We are there to understand technology, what is possible, what is practical, how it can be built, how it can be deployed. We can make it do, amazing things. But in each of those cases, whether you're talking about AI, you're talking about core software, or you're talking about what you're doing from a robotics standpoint, each of those things are ultimately hows. And our superpower is that. What we need to be more involved in and where we need more help is in getting into the empathetic cycle that is actually understanding the problems that need to be solved and the outcomes that need to be delivered. And I mean that in like the kindest and nicest way, but as a person who's relatively new to kind of this part of the industry, I see a lot of prescriptive requirements and the absence of an understanding of the problem we're actually trying to solve. And like what I need help with, right, to bring to bear the capabilities that we have and what we're capable of delivering as an industry, right, is I need to get much closer to understanding the real problems that we're facing and the needs associated with those, and I need to be able to put the people who specialize in the how as close as possible to that so that we can innovate incrementally. And I will continue to go back to Task Force 59 because I think that there's something really beautiful that happens in the messy part of innovation that as a collective group, I think we've been relatively reticent to embrace. That like I'm definitely here to break through because technology is imperfect, doesn't matter what kind of tool you lean into, but the only way that I'm going to be able to rapidly get it to a place where it's going to be able to support a warfighter and an engagement that we're going to be walking into that we have no way of predicting the dynamicism of is going to be that if I can get the how people much closer, right, to the actual problem statement. And so like when I think about some of the things that we've seen coming out of that, we're starting to break down the barriers and the assumptions associated with how things get built, right? Because when you run out of time and when you still have to protect our country and make decisions and build things that might be scrappy and imperfect, but it's better than nothing, like we're going to have to get a lot more comfortable with moving faster and with trusting people who have maybe different superpowers than we're accustomed to. So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mandy. So Don, and then for did you have
Yeah, can I hijack? Sorry, just to pile on one I think eloquent point just made. We often talk about when it's when acquiring or even evaluating new technology that we might deploy in a fight about risk of the maturity of that technology, risk to the ability to trust that technology. And I would just invite you, and I presume I'm speaking to more or less my choir here, that is that riskier than what we know to be true about the deficiencies in the current capabilities in our joint program? and the ability to deploy those capabilities and operate them under threat in a time and space. In some cases, the answer to that is yes. What we have today is still exquisite and outstanding, but it is not appropriate to every operational challenge that the Joint Force and our allies and partners are facing. And yet, I think the general tenet within the department, still within some operational units within Joint Force, is that I'd rather have the thing today that I've had for the better part of the last 3 decades because I know it, I understand it. Even if I know it's insufficient for me to accomplish my task. And so, there's arguably more risk that has been building in the status quo program for the better part of a decade and a half now. And it's at least time to recognize that there's more risk now in the nature of that program relative to what we are learning in Ukraine today in terms of its deficiencies, both in terms of the operational effectiveness of the capability, the ability to operate these capabilities in complex RF, GNSS denied environments, the ability to supply follow-on capabilities when those initial ones have been expended or defeated. It requires new approaches and enough hand-wringing on the problem. Let's actually start to take what Michael and team, as one example, did out in Task Force 59 and start to scale the mechanisms that enable the production and delivery of that capability. And it gets to like, how do you get closer to that problem to really understand it?
Yeah, there is something to be said for shifting the perception of risk away from risk of action alone to being able to assess as a whole risk of action versus inaction. And we have, particularly in the area of technology adoption right now, we have a heavy, heavy preference for risk of inaction, which is a challenge, but that's a shift that we need to make. So for Don and then for Michael, a separate question. So we've talked about a couple of operational challenges that have emerged, or challenges that have come out of the environment in Ukraine and Syria with the transparency of the battlefield, but also where that's very contested and important. Communication being very challenging from electronic warfare, from cyber attacks, and then in an Indo-Pacific scenario from the distances, at times they can pose some challenges as well. And then Mandy, I think, explained really well the idea of high-risk decision or high-consequence decision-making in very compressed timelines with people who are not used to those authorities, which when you combine with some of the communication issues are only compounded. So with that set that we've described, Don, how can industry and DoD come together more effectively than they do right now to address those issues? Because assuming a shared understanding or not, how can we work together closely in some of the ways that Michael's talked about, but in other ways as well, to address those?
Absolutely, this is a major challenge for the industry, especially folks working on the commercial side with less defense experience coming to the table, and I'll put myself and my company in that situation. I'm not a defense expert, but I think the important piece of the puzzle is coming to the table to have an understanding of what the true problems are. Again, as Mandy mentioned, it's less about prescribing the solutions. What I'm learning is that a lot of times the DoD knows intimately what the challenges on the ground are, what the problems are, and then they, at the same time, want to prescribe the solutions and then put very specific and strict requirements on those solutions and then send those over to industry. And that's how it's been done for a very long time. The problem is we need a lot more flexibility in our solutions. Taking it back to your previous question, I think one of the things that we're learning about the Ukraine war is the need for flexibility, especially as it pertains to robotics, right? The environment is literally changing by the minute, by the hour. You can't rely on brittle systems. So again, I'll speak from a robotics perspective. The challenge with robotics, and has been for the last 20 plus years, is that the systems are brittle. They don't offer the flexibility that the modern war zone is requiring. And so particularly as it pertains to things like mapping technologies, right? You can't go in and map an environment because the environment is literally going to be different the next time that you look at it. So you need a lot more flexibility in the solution, and that necessitates more complexity and more innovation and more novel solutions as it pertains to autonomy and AI. And a lot of these prescriptive requirements can often get in the way or at least slow down the innovation side. And so I think what we need to do is have form working groups, be more communicative, get the engineers who are designing the technology to sit with the end users who are actually on the battlefield, have a constructive conversation so that both sides truly understand the problem, and then together we can work on the solution.
So your point, though, is important because I think that there is something, both of us, I think, are relatively new to this world, that I've seen that I think is an unnecessary burden that DoD is carrying is, and I think what you and I are saying is the same. Like, we want to carry that burden, right? We want to help you figure out how. Like, that is what we do for a living. And the environments, there is no historical precedent of the rate and pace of innovation today. There is no historical precedent associated with how the landscape is changing from a digital and end environment need standpoint. And from an industry standpoint, I think we're all raising our hands saying, like, this is what we do, right? We want to do it more. But if we aren't involved until the part where the kind of book is written and you get all of the answers, chances are the rules have changed already anyway, and then we have to kind of go back through the process. And it's not to say that you throw it all away, right? I don't think that's the intent at all, but it's the kind of changing the life cycle of the point at which we get involved, because we can't do our best work unless we're involved a lot earlier. Sorry to hijack.
Yeah, and I saw this play out in the real world, in the operational environment there in the Fifth Fleet. And 2 points I kind of really want to touch on that are key to this enabling, actually 3 points. Number one, risk, right? Risk, our fleet commander, Admiral Cooper, took a big risk doing this. Our industry partners took a big risk. I can remember early conversations with Chris and the team at Anduril. We gave them unreasonable timelines, and there was a high risk, that you might not be able to perform. You applied the resource to deliver for us. I know it was the same for you, Mandy. We operated under very compressed timelines, which was high risk for the operator. It was high risk for me. It was high risk for Admiral Cooper, and it was risk for our industry partners. But you have to embrace that. The other sort of 2 key points that I wanted to make was that failure also has to be embraced, right? So we wanted to break the robots. We wanted to take them to the point of failure, because then we knew where the high end of the capability was, and we wanted to get on the other side of that. And so to your point earlier, one of the assets we had, we were actually on the 4th generation of that asset in 12 months, okay? So we were seeing software changes within hours and days, hardware changes within weeks and months. And that is enabled by a pace of iteration that I will suggest is only rivaled by what you see in Ukraine. And we had the Ukrainians out to the Robotics Operations Center at Task Force 59, but we were iterating every other week. So I was there 18 months. We did 20 international exercises, and then we kind of finish up with some real-world operations. That's a pace of iteration that you can literally see the technology evolving by the day. And then the final sort of key enabler was we were actually contracting for data as a service. So we didn't own any of the robots. We were leveraging a COCO model. And so we were getting the latest stuff now, Vice Legacy stuff, in 3 to 5 years from now. So a lot of sort of process things. And I just want to make one more point that Zach mentioned, that this is an intensely, human and creative process. We had really top tech engineers, but we also had, a Forbes 30 under 30 from Snapchat, that was on our team and now is on Zach's team at Anduril. Just a lot of sort of diversity of experience and a lot of creativity was required to sort of get after these problems in novel ways. So I think I know I said 3, but I gave 5 ingredients there. So excuse me for that.
Yeah.
Can I?
I want to pull the thread on iterative, and then how to think about iterative in ways that are like actually accretive over time. And my kids are now 13 and 10, so perhaps not as eager watchers of Pixar movies as they once were. But there are still some really good oldies in there. But if you look at just the the core baseline product that ultimately formed the foundation of Pixar and what Ed Catmull and the team did to build on that product over time. They learned with each movie. Each movie improved the tools that made that next movie better. And I think one of the demands that operating in the demanding way that Michael and his team asked of us and the other performers, it was not just the how are we iterating to solve this one problem. It's like, what are we learning as a business in terms of how we organize our core engineering functions to enable this product to be accretively getting better over time. We didn't just iterate against the one-point solution. Our job was to turn that back to how we're building that back into the core baseline product that every user beyond Michael now benefits from. And back to just like the juxtaposing of where risk lies. And again, in some cases, this way of approaching how we think about the generational build and upgrade of blocked assets, whether that's next generation fighter, next generation frigate. For many problems, we cannot think in terms of next generations. And our ability to iterate and build accretive solutions that are time responsive to the threat exist. But how we incentivize and then place the right sort of demands on industry to perform in that manner are not necessarily conducive to the way that capabilities are contracted for. And I know that we promised not to talk a lot about contracting, but it's material. Similar to the way in which capabilities were acquired as a service in support of the task force, we're engaged in a similar effort with Special Operations Command to counter unmanned systems. And as many in this audience know, and it was certainly the case when I was leaving the department in 2015 and 2016, Bob at the time stood up a task force to evaluate how we both better understood, characterized what were then Group 1 and Group 2 threats, crudely dropping ordnance over U.S. and allied forces, largely in the CENTCOM AOR. Fast forward only 18 months while we're trying to iterate against that problem, and all of a sudden the Iranians show up with increasingly sophisticated-looking Group 3, low-slowing cruise missile-like assets. How do you maintain not just an intercept capability, but a combination of radar, RF, computer vision to be able to adapt to what threat am I looking for, what salvos are they flying, how are they operating in mid-course and end-game, and then how do you contract for something that can keep up with that? It's its own demand for innovation and creativity in our acquisition cadre. And there's a lot of good changes happening in the department. But I think there's still a lot more that experimenting against problems can offer by way of creative examples of how we teach and learn within the acquisition community of how we better incent and then contract for capabilities that are time responsive to threats that are not generational.
So I'm going to ask one more question to the group, then we'll turn to audience questions after that, because we've got about 15 minutes left. But in terms of how DoD and industry can partner together more effectively, for problem curation and then for some of the identification challenges, and then for developing technology, we've come up with a couple of themes so far. We've talked about pairing engineers or industry and warfighters very closely. That's come up over and over again. We've talked about the flexibility of understanding the problem and then actually bringing technologists to problem curation instead of having strict requirements as well. Using a sprint process with unreasonable timelines, which I think gets after, Michael, you mentioned that, but it gets after some of the things that Mandy mentioned with the sense of urgency and pushing us where you can get to field capabilities as well. And there's been a few others. But one of the things that Don said that I thought was really interesting was the idea of not just pairing together and keeping that flexibility during problem curation, but never stopping. As you move through this iterative process, you have flexibility nonstop, not just because it's better development, but because that's actually necessary for the needs in warfare. So the last question for me for the group would be, what is it that DoD and industry both can do to work together more closely and more effectively for that iterative process so we can adapt and get to where those unreasonable timelines that Michael talked about are not just reasonable, but they're actually quite normal for software and for hardware. So we'll start with Mandy and go to Don next.
So I think that there's this, my perspective around the best way to get to really iterative and evolving processes between the two groups is to get everyone very vector aligned on the outcome and then create environments where the outcome is the thing that's measured. It's not necessarily the number of times we need to go to bat. It's not necessarily the sort of number of wins. We just have to look at whether we're getting to the place that we want to get to at the end and be less focused on how messy the process is in the middle, because sometimes the best innovation happens in the messiest way. And I think we've talked a lot about Task Force 59 and IMX, but I think the IMX 23, which we just wrapped, right, is you just keep kind of moving the ball forward, right? It's totally incremental and it's scrappy, right? You know, you're it's like slinging code in the command center, figuring out how to respond. And it isn't because that's the stuff that's necessarily ready to ship out the production door the next day. But what you're getting at is that kind of raw essence of something that crosses the threshold of how you know you've actually created something that matters, right? And what I want to see a lot more of is that complete and utter clarity around the outcome. And if we can do that, I think even with the language barriers and even with the, like, I'm still catching up with some of the acronyms, right? And, you know, if we can, okay, yeah, Godspeed to me. I think 15 years from now, maybe I'll be 40% of the way there. But if we can park that, like, I do think sometimes as industry, it can feel really scary because it's almost like weaponized, right? Like, you don't understand it, so you can't come here. But we have, like, I don't know, I feel like I have a lot to bring to the table. And if somebody can just help me understand what each of those pieces means, like, I can use my superpowers, right? I don't need you to learn my superpower. I need you to be really good at yours. And then we can kind of figure out how to move the ball forward. So outcomes, all day, outcomes.
Thank you, Mandy. That's a strong core message to take away, too. Don?
Sure. So I think that the department can continue to iterate on policies that make it easier for companies to come into the fold, to come into the defense space. I think the efforts that have been implemented around DIU and AF Works, as an example, are really helping push the ball in the right direction. The other thing I would offer is when you think about the way that the private capital markets fund companies and pick winners and choose products, they take really big, risky bets, and they make a lot of bets. And sometimes, or most of the time, those bets don't succeed. But occasionally, you knock it out of the park, you hit a grand slam. And those are the types of products that really change the world, and those are the types of products, and those are the companies that we all know and love and use today. And the DoD side is exactly the opposite, right? They're trying to minimize risk. Every dollar spent needs to be able to show value, and the risk of failure or the consequence of failure is extremely high. And unfortunately, I think that really can hold back innovative solutions for challenges that are facing our warfighters today. And it's been done this way for good reason and for a very long time. And I'm not here to suggest that the DoD should be, placing lots of investment bets on lots of companies, but I think those are two ends of a spectrum. And if you can find yourself moving more towards the center, or at least off of one end of the spectrum, that you will find that you get a lot more high hits, positive results that actually make a material difference at the end of the day, as opposed to incremental or evolutionary differences. And so I think that probably that mindset shift is something that's really important and really needs to be considered. I know that that's difficult, but I think progress, as far as I see it, progress is being made, which is really exciting. The other area that is really tricky and definitely needs to be thought about is IP. Dual-use technology, I think, is the future for the DoD. It's the future for defense. Being able to capture the advantages for companies that are investing in existential commercial products and pull that IP over for government use is really important, because there's a lot of amazing work that's happening in the commercial sector. But traditionally, IP has been a challenge. Who owns the IP? What is the freedom to move it from left to right or back right to left, right? Things that are developed for the Department of Defense, can they be used for commercial purposes? For companies like Kodiak, that's really important. right? We want to be pushing our commercial product farther and faster, saving lives, improving efficiencies on our roadways in the US, and I think that's really important. And we want to be able to use that data, those learnings, and bring them over into the defense space. There's a ton of data. While it's not exactly the same data, there's a lot of overlap, tremendous amount of overlap that we can pull into the defense use case, but we have to make sure that both sides understand how the IP is going to flow.
Thank you. Just real quick note to the audiences, we don't have any questions yet, so please feel free to populate the queue for the questions. Then we'll go to Michael and then Zach. Michael.
So, I just want to play off of what Don says. We need more risk takers. We need more Admiral Coopers, more General Carillas. These guys are forces of nature. They're risk takers. They have a very, very strong bias towards action. We need more people like that taking big risks because, the times demand it. And then I think we need more creativity. We need more sort of like artists in the space, imagining a future different than the one we've been sort of planting, for the past 20 years. So I think, that sort of, creativity, this is very much a human endeavor. We talked a lot about robotics and artificial intelligence. But for me, this is very, very much a huge human endeavor, and we need more risk takers and more creativity.
Yeah, more people with spiked boots.
Just one quick
Like
comment.
boots, that's mad.
It makes
Yeah.
a statement, definitely.
Mandy, I don't want any issues with you.
Don?
Yeah, sorry. Just one more quick comment. I think it's worth conveying to the group, which is the sentiment in Silicon Valley and the sentiment around companies like Kodiak and innovative startups. Perhaps because of the Ukraine war, most likely because of the Ukraine war, we are seeing a lot more interest from engineers, from AI developers in the national defense effort. And I think that is that's a really good sign, and we need to find ways to take advantage of the fervor that is happening at these companies. Because 3 years ago, there was zero interest in work, or 4 or 5 years ago, there was not as much interest in working with defense. But now there's real support. There's actual support, and that's super exciting. So we need to take advantage, we need to find ways to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the tech community who comes from big tech is really starting to understand how important it is to use the superpowers that they've cultivated in the private sector for the protection of our country. And I think that's a very unique moment in time that if we can figure it out and take advantage of, we're going to bring a lot of really powerful capabilities to the warfighter.
Thanks. And then Zach.
Well, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but I'm just noticing the inadequacy of my footwear relative to Mandy.
I dressed down today.
It's quite impressive.
No one wanted to say anything to you about it in the green room.
I know. I just couldn't help but stare at it now, so now I'm noticing it.
It's the whole point.
But in all candor, I think one of the best things that the department could do in the near term, back to just the richness of data that's accessible, both commercial and then particularly for the department's commercial partners that might not be regular participants at both unclassified and classified war games, that don't have the right channels of access to the rich operations analysis data that the services hold, that elements in OSD hold. Our ability to characterize and understand the problem is available to us. How we mature and use those tools, and there are many in this room today that are some element of that ecosystem where our ability to characterize specific red assets has never been better in SIM. Never been better, and it's only going to get better. Our ability to characterize not just the asset, but how it maneuvers in time and space, how it maneuvers in concert with other aerial and ground assets has never been better. We don't need to just expose at the operational problem level where we're all going out to IMEXs, to integrated battle problems. Those two are incredibly invaluable for the department's industry partners. But better channels by which to have honest exchanges of data will just accelerate the learning, especially when the learning is happening within modern software stacks. Our ability to learn at machine speed, to Hondo's point, is there. And so let's accelerate the learning of those partners. Let's not chunk it out over time. Our ability to get you up to speed and your team up to speed has never been better positioned. So thinking about the mechanisms by which the department and the services expose that data to a broader surface of industry, I think would be one productive byproduct.
Thank you, Zach. So we've only got about 3.5 minutes left. So we started out by talking about a little bit about the relationship between DoD and industry. Then we moved into problem curation and had some very pointed ideas about that in a good way. And then talked about partnership to solve the operational challenges that industry and DoD have identified together. Then how to continue developing, adapting, and fielding technology more effectively with a better relationship. So I'll close out with the hardest question, probably, is in 30 seconds, moving from Michael over this way, can you say what's the one takeaway that you would want someone in the audience who's a congressional staffer, who works at a company in an industry, or is someone in the executive branch who can partner with industry or make decisions about how DoD partners with industry? In 30 seconds, what's the one thing you would want them to not just know, but do when they leave here? So, Michael, we'll start with you.
Their PowerPoints are nice, but all the PowerPoints you see here in DC are not necessarily based in reality. There is no substitute for doing in the real world in extreme conditions versus real problems alongside warfighters. Full stop.
Thank you. Don?
15 seconds. I yield my 15 seconds back.
I was impressed.
I would just reiterate that iterating on policies that empower organizations like DIU to go out and find innovative companies that are doing amazing things in the commercial sector and bringing those technologies to the defense effort, that is the most important thing that we can be doing.
Thank you, Don. Mandy?
So as someone who's sat in a variety of different industries, all of which have their own experience associated with regulation and how you work through the process, I think the thing that I would ask and encourage each of you is there are more patterns than you think, and many different industries have had to walk paths associated with how to figure out how to use some of these more advanced capabilities in environments that are not traditionally accustomed to. I'm not saying that it's the same. It's not. But when you think about the challenges that we face, like the sort of human factor is persistent, right? Regardless of where you look, there are ways to do this faster. There are ways to learn from other industries that have had to figure out how to do this in their own way. And I would really encourage each of you to think a little bit outside of the box when you go back and look for those analogous patterns. Because if we can start to learn from other places, and I am thinking very much about some of the regulation that we've navigated associated with AI in the medical world, right, in the medical device world, surprising number of patterns in there associated with some of the things that we're seeing here, because at the end of the day, you're still talking about life, right, and the absolute obligation we have to do the best that we can to make sure that we're protecting and keeping that at the forefront of the decisions that we make as we deploy technology. So don't be afraid to lift your head up and look at things that don't necessarily look exactly the same. I think there's still patterns to be learned in there.
Thank you, Mandy. Zach?
I've got 21 seconds.
That was my fault.
That's okay. You've got great shoes. I think just to continue to encourage folks to learn by doing. I mean, to Michael's point, like one of the many elements that are valuable about the IMEX's and integrated battle problems, among them is discerning those limits of the capability to enable us to continue pressing higher. Similar for the policy folks, and I know Mike Horowitz was on earlier, like Mike's team has been great at engaging early the operational users to understand like how policy and regulation should be informed by the actual operational use of that technology. And I would say the same should be held for how we think about the control and export of these capabilities to our allies and partners, such that we're not all learning together. We're going to be running behind the curve relative to our ability to get this capability scaled and in the hands of those that need it most. So the more folks that are on the policy regulatory side that can be exposed at the problem side to how these technologies are being deployed and improved, the more constructive policy and regulation will be to enabling the safe and scaled use of these capabilities.
Thank you, Zach. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
you.